Many years ago, I was walking downtown when I was approached by one of the city's homeless population. As I went to give him some money, I realized that the smallest bill that I had on me was actually rather larger than what I would normally consider giving. But at this point, I had my wallet out. I was committed to the action. And after all, aren't we called to give sacrificially? So I smiled, handed over the bill, and as he took it, his eyes widened, and he said, "Are you sure?" I smiled, I nodded. I said, "Yeah." And as I walked away, I heard him behind me say, "God bless you." And a verse from Scripture came into my mind at the same time as I heard his words. The same verse that we sang today in our responsorial psalm. "The Lord hears the cry of the poor." We usually understand this to mean that the Lord hears the anguished and desperate cry of the poor in their need. But in this moment, I wondered if maybe it could also mean the Lord hears the cry of blessing from a poor, grateful for some kindness shown. I like to think that's true. This particular incident came not too long in my life after a period of difficulty of my own, a time of hardship. I was never quite so desperate as this young man begging on the street, but it was definitely a time of my life when I lived the experience that the psalmist tells us about today, that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and those who are crushed in spirit he saves. It was a time in my life when I discovered a much closer, much more intimate relationship with God than I had never ever known before, or that I've known since then. In our reading from Sirach today, it starts out by telling us that the Lord is not unduly partial to the weak, then proceeds to tell us why the Lord is particularly partial to the weak. We are told that the prayer of the lowly pierces the clouds. It does not rest until it reaches its goal, nor will it withdraw till the Most High responds. It tells us that the Lord is a God of justice who knows no favorites. But then it says that he is most responsive to those who have no other resources to draw upon. Like St. Paul says in the second letter to Timothy, he says that when no one appeared on his behalf and everyone had deserted him, the Lord stood by him and gave him strength. The Lord hears the cry of the poor. And as God's church, we are called in a special way to serve the poor, to be attentive to their needs. In Catholic social teaching, we're told of what's called a preferential option for the poor, which means that in all things we should consider the needs of the poor before we consider the wants of the rich. This is the heart of God's justice. Now, we are not God. We don't have God's perfect sense of justice. And so where God, for his part, can afford to be not unduly partial to the weak, his word in Scripture to us is heavily weighted towards the preferential option for the poor. We live our lives within a worldly imbalance of values and assumptions. We struggle with prejudices, our own and our society's. Prejudices which tend to favor the rich and the powerful. The Lord is not deaf to the wail of the orphan, Scripture tells us, but unfortunately the world too often is. This is why we, as God's holy people, are called to be mindful of that imbalance. The Lord hears the cry of the poor, but the worldly hear only the boasts of the rich. Like the Pharisee that Jesus tells us of in the gospel today. This Pharisee who offers a prayer not to God, we are told, but to himself. A prayer that is focused entirely on the ways in which he is better and more worthy than anyone else. Reminds me a little bit of a sales call I got once. The solicitor opened with, "Hello, how are you today?" and then launched straight into her sales pitch without even pausing for a breath. Normally I would wait for an opportunity to make a polite excuse before hanging up on a sales call like this. But in this instance, I felt like the caller wouldn't even notice I was gone. And I wonder if God might have had the same feeling about this Pharisee's prayer. A prayer that leaves no opening for dialogue, no opportunity for relationship. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, Jesus tells us. But the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Does this mean that we should all divest ourselves entirely of all worldly possessions and rely on God's providence for everything? I don't think so. Some may be drawn to that way of life, and if you feel that you are, that's great. I would recommend a lot of spiritual direction and guidance before you take that plunge, but if you truly feel called to be the next St. Francis, more power to you. For the rest of us, our challenge is to recognize that the Lord is especially close to the poor among us, to the suffering, to those who go unnoticed. We are challenged to have the humility to treat them as we would treat Christ himself. As St. John Chrysostom once said, "If we cannot find Christ in the poor, we will never see him in the Eucharist." The Lord hears the cry of the poor, and he sends us, his church, his holy people, to try and ease their suffering. And when we give ourselves in his service to them, he does bless us for our efforts.